Well, welcome to tonight's seminar. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Mark Gilbert, Professor of History at SAIS Europe, Grove Haynes Professor of History at SAIS Europe. And for 3 years now, I've been running a seminar called The History of the Present. And this seminar basically aims to do two things. The first is I've invited people who have presented us with a first draft of history, showing reasons for thinking that a given event is likely to be of historical significance. Or else, alternatively, and this has been perhaps more common, showing the historical roots of present issues. We've had some very distinguished speakers in the series. Margaret Macmillan came last year, the famous historian of World War I. Kiran Patel from the University of Munich, who spoke about the New Deal and the concept of the New Deal and its relevance in international affairs. Well, tonight's speaker, Alessandra Bitumi, is not yet an eminent historian, although I have a feeling she will be one day, but she has done fascinating work on transatlantic public diplomacy and is currently finishing an important book in Italian, but I hope it will be published in English too, on Atlantica, Relazioni Euro-Americane 1945-2016. I think presumably 2016 was chosen as the end date because after that relations got worse, I'm not sure. Anyway, Alessandra is Assistant Professor of Political History at Amsterdam's Vrije University. Before that, she taught at Edinburgh University, and did postdoctoral work at the Sorbonne in Paris. She was awarded the doctorate with distinction by the University of Pavia. Now, Alessandra, I don't know whether you know this, but SAIS, of course, is founded on a particular, so I'm sure you do know this, is founded by a particular idea of transatlantic relations and the concept of an Atlantic community, believe it or not, which I'm sure you're very familiar with, far more familiar than I am, was actually developed here at SAIS in a number of conferences in the late 1950s and early 1960s, particularly one, not long after the election of President Kennedy in 1961, in which the keynote speaker was Arthur Schlesinger. So I think you're at the right place to talk about transatlantic relations and to give us some historical background, to give us some historical insight on the current state of transatlantic relations. Thanks for coming. We're really looking forward to your talk. 40 minutes or so, and at the end there'll be Q&A, and I would ask people to use the Q&A function on your screens. Thanks very much. Alessandra, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Professor Gilbert. Good evening, everyone, or good morning to those of you who are watching from overseas. Thank you for this indeed much welcomed invitation. I am glad and honored to be giving this lecture, and I do apologize for not being in Bologna. I would have loved to be back and to go back to a city which is particularly dear to me, but this does not seem the most propitious time for academic travels. But we should look at the bright side, as we've been asked to do for the past 2 years. And the bright side is that more people can be simultaneously connected from different countries, which would make for a richer audience. I hope that my lecture will trigger a lively conversation among us all, and I will start by sharing my screen. Hopefully it won't crash. Can you see my slide?
Yep.
Okay, and we can begin. So I've been invited, as the title suggests, to reflect on the history of transatlantic relations and the lessons it allegedly offers. But let me begin by questioning, though, the very notion that historical knowledge offers applicable lessons. In my view, in my understanding of my discipline, history offers warnings more than lessons. It provides us with the past that is necessary to contextualize and historicize the present, but not to visualize nor predict the future. Historical knowledge is useful, indeed vital, not because history repeats itself, not because it is cyclical or serial, but because it explains the nature of where we stand and how we got here, its contents and its story, its complexity, its opaqueness, so to speak. And this is possibly the most important lessons of history, particularly for students. History teaches us to think in complex terms. By moving in time and space, it teaches us to put ourselves in someone else's shoes and to instinctively mistrust our prejudices and the simplifications that come along with them. So after this disciplinary caveat, I will, in my talk, I will try to do mainly three things. I will define the nature of the transatlantic relationship, for how it was shaped in the post-1945 period. We will then discuss the drivers and the matrices, and eventually outline its structural, one would like to say, contradictions and dilemmas. So I will try, in other words, to historicize and contextualize the current state of transatlantic relations. And here we use somehow interchangeably the terms Atlantic Alliance, Atlantic Community, Atlantica, transatlantic relations. And by them, I intend the relations between the US and the European allies, as well as between the US and the European Union. And once done this, I will try to reflect on today and on whether the many powerful glues of Atlantic are still holding, and if its contradictions and dilemmas are still manageable. So, the nature of Atlantica, to begin with. When preparing for this lecture, I wondered if there was a way to summarize in a few minutes the key distinctive features of contemporary transatlantic relations, of that compact binding the United States and its European allies. And in doing so, which would be the best way to convey the historical unicity of such community. It's being in many ways exceptional, and in its common self-representation exceptionalist. And I came to the conclusion, not original, I can see, but rather solid, I believe, that the two key terms and categories most useful to fulfill this task are integration and institutionalization. In a world marked by ever deeper forms of integration and, in part, institutionalization and in governance, Atlantic is being characterized by a significant surplus of both. And that's visible in all the major realms that we commonly use to study contemporary transatlantic relations: security, economics, culture, ideology, and politics, which somehow subsume them all. The level of integration in the security realm and through NATO is unparalleled, both if measured historically. Has there ever been such a long-standing multilateral defensive alliance? The answer is no. Or comparatively, NATO's attempted Cold War replicas, the Central Treaty Organization or the Southeast Asia Treaty Organization, both were dissolved between 1977 and 1979, they end up being poor and malfunctioning copies of the original. And as for today, the US system of bilateral and minilateral alliances in the Asia-Pacific does not really compare. Security, of course, has been matched by economics via the creation of an Atlantic economic space, although at times frustratingly partial and constantly contested. But trade and finance provide illustrative examples in this regard. A quick glance to the main destinations of US foreign direct investments is highly revealing. I'm giving you some data here to visualize what I'm saying. So in 1950, 38% of American FDIs, 38% of their total went to Latin America, 30% to Canada, and only 15% to Western Europe. By 1976, the ratio was 41 to Europe, 25 to Canada, and 18 to Latin America. One would imagine that after NAFTA, now US-Mexico-Canada agreement, and the new centrality of China and the Asia-Pacific would dramatically redirect the main routes of these investments. But latest data oblige us to think twice. As of 2020, US FDIs to Europe were 4 times those going to the Asia-Pacific or Latin America, Mexico included. And those trends work both ways, with the United States being by a long margin the main recipient of European FDIs. As for total trade volumes, the EU is still the main trade partner of the United States. And some countries of the so-called old continent, Germany, of course, but also Italy, have long enjoyed very large and for their export-led economies quite important surpluses with the United States. When we move to the more immaterial dimension of cultural integration, hard data and precise empirical examples are more complicated to find and to imagine. And yet, to rely on a classical example, you can see a picture here, the persistent success of the many facets of US pop culture in Europe continue to speak volumes about Atlantica. You take, for example, cinema and the country where I live now, France, a country that possibly like no other has promoted a campaign to defend, support, and subsidize national cultural products, beginning with cinema or music. Well, in 2019, the last pre-pandemic and therefore statistically reliable year, among the top 20 movies in France, 17 were US productions or co-productions, and only 3 were French. Meanwhile, this is what the picture refers to, the 2-day US-born Lollapalooza rock festival, perhaps some of you are familiar with it. It was first introduced in France in 2017 in Paris, what it has rapidly beat all the attendance records for music events. So long story short, much unfashionable as exceptionally historical interpretations have rightly become nowadays, there is indeed something unique, exceptional in modern transatlantic relations. And the model integration plus institutionalization offers a simple but a rather effective way to describe and to sum up this exceptionalism. Now, moving to history, let's consider the drivers and the matrices of this unique entanglement. What has driven this increasingly integrated Atlantica? What were its main causes and the fundamental preconditions? Of course, different drivers and conditions can be identified. For the sake of simplicity and in time, I'll only mention 3 here. The first one is largely known. It is the negative and yet immensely powerful driver represented by the existence of a common enemy and a common threat, the Soviet Union. Atlantica in many ways is a Cold War creature, set up in response to the threat represented by the Soviet Union. This is not to overlook the pre-1914 roots of Euro-American entanglement, but the end of the Second World War, from a transatlantic history perspective, is a watershed, marks a watershed, a turning point. The reorganization of the post-war Western order pivoted on the construction of a solid Euro-Atlantic system resting on a set of principles and rules and a shared institutional framework. A broad transatlantic consensus was forged by the pervasive influence of Cold War liberalism, containment of the Soviet Union, and the inescapable and irreducible antagonism with the Soviet enemy. An enemy, well known, whose existence led in 1949 to the establishment of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. An establishment that signified the ultimate American departure from a policy of no entangling alliances and permanently tied US security to Western Europe's. Within this overarching structure of the bipolar conflict, the US and Western Europe established and invariably buttressed a liberal, democratic, prosperous, and secure area, which leads us to the second driver, capitalism, of course. Because Cold War was also about saving capitalism from itself, with powerful interest fostering new forms of transatlantic integration or building on pre-existing ones. Under US leadership, a new institutional framework was tasked with the management of the global economy. I'm sure you're familiar with its keystones, the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade. What became improperly known as the Bretton Woods system not only contributed to an almost unprecedented growth and stability for quite a long time, but it also qualified the path to growth in a distinctive way, which coalesced the Atlantic allies under US leadership. And I'm referring here to what we call, what we define the system of embedded liberalism. The third driver was a deliberately constructed ideological cement, emphasizing common civilizational tropes, including race and religion in its early years, and then shifting to the alleged shared common denominator. And this was indeed a crucial dimension in the transatlantic post-war order. In this slide, you see a quote by Dean Acheson, the US Secretary of State, in the formative years of the Atlantic community. And he explicitly refers to the affinity and natural identity of interest, to the fact that NATO was the product of at least 350 years of history based on moral and ethical beliefs and on the acceptance of the same values in life. There's three drivers and three pillars of the transatlantic post-war order buttressed an Atlantic community grounded on a strong American hegemony, because the Atlantic Euro-American community was hierarchically structured and organized from the very beginning. And the United States proved capable of negotiating a specific international order sustained by a general domestic consensus, widely accepted by its European counterparts and maintained mostly without coercion. Multiple leverages were used to promote and to reinforce it in the economic, cultural, military, and political realms. And such a multidimensional manifestation of the hegemony made it all the more pervasive, enduring, and ultimately effective. But this does not mean in any way that the community was conflict-free or crisis-free, which leads almost inevitably to discuss the flaws, the contradictions, and fundamental recurring dilemmas of contemporary transatlantic relations. The first that comes to mind, particularly nowadays, is, of course, the thorny issue of burden sharing. Now, burden sharing has plagued post-1949 Atlantica from the very beginning. And it has somehow been illustrative of a broader inner contradiction deriving from the very asymmetrical nature of the Atlantic community. European ambitions notwithstanding, Atlantica has never been an alliance among peers and equals. Frustrations, recriminations, accusations have invariably ensued, with the United States urging the Europeans to do more, to finally and equitably share the burden, and accusing them of free riding on US protection, while at the same time fearing Europe's greater strategic autonomy and independence, particularly after the end of the Cold War. And with the Europeans on their side resenting the US quasi-imperial privileges and American dominance, and yet at the same time demanding protection and fearing a possible US disengagement. Historical examples here abound, and you can find some of them here in the slides. This one refers to France and to the French withdrawal from NATO's integrated military command structure. In 1966, all Allied headquarters were removed from French territory. This one, I don't know how many of you are familiar with this, but it refers to the conclusion of Senator Mike Mansfield's intervention demanding a curtailment of American military commitment in Europe. It was 1973, and a senator proposed that the US would cut in half the number of its troops in Europe. In the 1970s, the burden sharing imbalance was one of the largest in NATO's history, and NATO was more divided than ever and under greater stress than ever than at any time since its creation in 1949. Its members had different views on Vietnam, different views on détente, and there were pressing questions to answer. Will NATO survive? The defection of a very important and key member state in Europe, France, with differences over military strategy, and particularly the role and the use of nuclear weapons, divide the allies. These recriminations and frustrations continued also after the Cold War. A more recent and perhaps more popular example is offered by President Obama's comments on his European allies over burden sharing, and particularly over Libya. Obama said, "Free riders," while referring to European allies, "they aggravate me," and in a famous interview to Jeffrey Goldberg on the Atlantic. But the never-ending controversy over how to share burden has been matched by other areas of contention within Atlantica. Trade, first and foremost, with endless negotiations. Culture, and the debate on anti-Americanism clearly offers an example, but also the parallel evolution of bilateral relations between the senior American partner and a junior European ally. You have a picture here portraying two European allies, France and Germany at the time. Allies bestowed with the function of being, if not a Trojan horse, certain a pro-US actor in a given transatlantic issue. One example among many, and a very recent one, Italy played such a role for an Obama administration that was clearly at odds with Germany's austerity policies post-2009. Obama recognized the importance of Italy, but it also urged Italy to contest Germany's austerity recipes within the European Union. Let's just think of the Greek crisis. And such bilateral relations have frequently been a thorn in the Atlantic alliance, sometimes used by the United States to divide its allies. We commonly refer to a strategy of divide et impera and prevent them from forming a common front. But more frequently, they were exploited by Washington's lesser allies to pursue their own objectives and assert, as I said, a kind of special position both within the alliance and in the relationship with the United States, expandable also on the domestic political front. So to sum up and conclude this first part, Atlantica has been and is historically unique, indeed exceptional, insofar as it has produced and at the same time has been the product of unique and highly institutionalized multi-layered forms of integration. And yet, because of its very nature, particularly structurally hierarchical form, its history has been marked by frequent tensions, themselves the product of some of its inner structural dilemmas. American leadership has been, at the same time, the federating force, the federating driver of Atlantica, and the key element of a systemic asymmetry that at times has nourished tensions and divisions between the United States and its allies. Which leads me to today. As I said, and I continue to repeat myself on this, but history does not offer straightforward applicable lessons. That's the mechanic illusion of some applied history daydream. But it does provide warnings, alerting signals that historians should be able to detect. So what do we know? What can we say about the relationship between the United States and its European allies? What does Biden and Blinken's renewed Atlanticism show? How can we relate it to history, not to the lessons it does not offer, but to the complex past that has produced today's reality? Specific and contingent crises aside, such as the current one on Ukraine, the public commentary tends to focus on two primary and historical areas of disagreement: security and trade. Areas in which the 4 years of Trump should have been immensely destructive for the Atlantic community. The failure of the ambitious, very ambitious Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership, you see here a picture of the used trade ship Cecilia Malmstrom, was followed by Trump's trade war. I chose one of the tweets by President Trump to help you visualize what I'm saying. With Trump at the White House, fundamental Atlantic commitments, beginning with Article 5, were questioned. NATO was proclaimed either obsolete or dangerous. During a bizarre exchange with Tucker Carlson on Fox News, I'm not sure if you've ever watched it, there's an interesting clip, still accessible. Trump remarked that because of Article 5, the very aggressive people of Montenegro or Albania could drag the United States into a useless conflict. And boom, President Trump said, you're in World War III. The controversy over burden sharing, we all know, reoccupied center stage. And as far as American stance towards the EU was concerned, Trump did depart from the traditional support to the process of European integration, support that was far from never changing. It was traditionally a controversial support, but President Trump blatantly supported Brexit and even expressed hope for the disintegration of the European Union. And yet, on trade, the European Union remained Washington's main trade partner, pre-pandemics last year, 2019, witnessed the largest volume trade and EU surplus ever. The burden sharing and Article 5 controversies subsided. NATO continued to operate as if it was on a sort of autopilot, producing its very anodyne, at least to me, strategic concepts and promoting long-planned projects as if almost nothing had changed in that regard. And the EU has survived Trump and, as of today, to some extent, also Brexit. Does this mean that the transatlantic relationship remains on a strong and ultimately immutable path, that history has produced a structure sufficiently solid and resilient to survive whichever turbulence and change? Well, so far, history has proved, to quote a major expert in the field, Jussi Animaki, that transatlantic relations are not going back to normal because normal has always been there. Normal has been there all along. The coexistence of community and conflict has been the most enduring characteristic of what Animaki defines as Pax Transatlantica. Whether it is likely to remain so, whether this historic trend is likely to continue in the foreseeable future, we don't know. As a historian, I certainly do not know. I'm sorry, historians' answers to questions on current affairs are at times frustrating, as it seems we end up raising as many questions as we try to answer. We almost instinctively model the picture instead of simplifying it. That's our job. And when we look at the past to make sense of the present, or at least to detect some elements capable of helping us with the present, I think we should be very careful in avoiding a double trap, that of presentism and that of essentialism. And both traps are visible in much of the commentary on today's transatlantic relations. The presentists tend to postulate the uniqueness of a given crisis, and the argument is that what we are experiencing is an unprecedented crisis and that it's going to break the community for how we know it. The essentialists or minimizers tend to maintain that the crisis under our eyes is, well, just another transatlantic crisis produced by the very essence of the alliance. And just as in the past, it is bound to be somehow managed and resolved. Historians typically walk between these lines, or at least they should. And the lesson we have learned from the past in this specific field is that there has never been a golden age of US-European cooperation. Transatlantic relations have been structurally punctuated by ups and downs. So there is no mythical past to go back to. There is a working relationship that has for a long time served the interest of both its constituent parts. And for this very reason, it is a relationship that is perhaps worth mending when it suffers a crisis. And for the sake of the exercise that I've been asked to do here, I will conclude by identifying today's significant new challenges that could expose and even magnify some of the inner weaknesses and contradictions of the Atlantic Alliance, and therefore breed, nurture, produce serious crisis. The first one concerns domestic dynamics that are at play both within the United States and within and across Europe. Dynamics that have created a condition that seems less conducive to fostering solid, unshakable transatlantic relations. As Ann Applebaum, The Atlantic, warned day after the election, the latest election, Biden can restore the pre-Trump status quo. To quote another scholar, historian Jeremy Edelman, reflecting on the events of January the 6th, you have a picture here on the left that precisely refers to January 6th, wrote that what the world watched last week, I'm quoting him, was the opening of a cusp between two folk, two bundles of values, icons, and stories. A deeply polarized and fractured country, still reeling from the disastrous US wars of the 21st century and the long-term consequences of the crisis of 2007, 2009. And on top of that, you had the pandemic. is a country where the request to protect and reassert US sovereignty is widespread and inevitably impacts some of the main practical and ideological pillars of the Atlantic community. There is a tension, if not an incompatibility, between what in Italy we call sovranismo. Perhaps the French term has become more famous, souverainisme, and Atlantic integration. I couldn't find a proper translation for this term. So it's a tension that is vividly on display in the US, has been vividly on display during the past years, but it is also visible in Europe. Anyone following the presidential debate here in France nowadays, just to give you an example, is struck by what a scholar recently called, and I found the title of this article very telling, l'insolente santé du souverainisme, referring to the strength and the centrality of this concept across the board. The second challenge is connected to globalization more broadly. So transatlantic integration, I've argued opening this lecture, has been unique. And yet, post-1970s, it has evolved within a more general process of global integration, as we all know, which has only intensified and accelerated in the post-Cold War age. And this has produced multiple interdependencies and somehow reduced the leverage of the United States within the hierarchical structure of Atlantica. It is often argued that today Europe is less strategically central for the United States, and that by pivoting to the Asia Pacific, Washington has downgraded the geopolitical importance of its European allies. Yes and no, and if this were totally true, it would be hard to make sense of Biden and Blinken's renewed and broadcasted Atlanticism, which is founded on the assumption that the Europeans should share the burden, also in the new US policy of containment of China, first and foremost by joining the United States in the effort to decouple the global economy from China, by reducing Beijing's role in the global supply chains or vetting more severely China's FDIs in order to reduce the conditionalities that China enjoyed thanks to that. So the problem might be that Europe has lost centrality, but the problem is also that on this dossier and on this particular challenge, Europe and the United States clearly don't see eye to eye, even because the current integration has produced a significantly different and more interdependent system when compared to the Cold War. On China, Republicans and Democrats' positions have become progressively less and less distinguishable. Biden has defined the country as the first geopolitical and technological rival to the US. His slogan, Buy American, Make It in America, reinstate the validity of the protectionist choice. Despite a definitely less aggressive rhetoric as compared to Trump's, policy-wise, there is not much discontinuity. And an issue that could trigger the next transatlantic rift over China is a comprehensive agreement on investment, the famous CAI, an agreement that if ratified would boost trade and investment relations between the EU and China, as well as have profound implications for the United States. And of course, the evolution of the current crisis over Ukraine will say much about the future path of transatlantic relations. Russia's attack would mark a definitive end to the rules-based international order, opening the door to a new era of global insecurity that would threaten decades of unprecedented peace throughout most of Europe. And as some strategists and specialists in the field argue, for Russia, driving a wedge between transatlantic partners is likely at least as important as Ukraine itself. So we will see what the future holds, remembering that, as most scholars warn, the key challenge of Atlantic relations has always invariably been to adjust the balance between integration and autonomy. I'll stop here, stop sharing, and I'm more than happy to elaborate on some of the things that I said during the lecture, just to answer your questions. Thank you.
Alessandra, thank you very much. You've given us a lot of food for thought. What I'm going to do is open up to people here in the auditorium. I'm going to ask you a question myself, and then in the meantime, people online, you can send in your questions to me using the Q&A function while you're answering the first round of questions. So I'm going to ask my own question first, and then I think Professor Meyer is chafing at the bit here and is hoping to ask a question too. So my question was, and I was actually quite interested about this because your work has been so much on the links between policymakers and, to some extent, you could almost argue the soft power element to the Atlantic relationship, and yet you talk mostly about questions of of state and of the economy and of strategy and so forth, which was terrific, and I think we learned a lot. You said a bit more about the soft power dimension. Do you think we've actually, do you think the bond is still as strong as it used to be?
Should I answer, or should we collect questions?
You can answer yes, and then I'll open it up.
Well, it's a very interesting question. Is it still there? So I was looking recently at a poll on transatlantic trends, on the resilience of the American allure and myth in Europe, and it has actually decreased significantly since 2003. It's not that whoever sits in the White House, there are trends at play, and even if with Obama and later Biden, polls and approval ratings went back to normal after the Bush years and the Trump's years, it seems that Europeans today are less bonding with Americans as compared to previous decades. And the same perhaps might be true for the Americans. If we look at, student exchange programs. I've studied Fulbright program for a long time and other public diplomacy programs. More and more programs are open and they attract Asian students, and so the student population is getting more and more diverse. And the same applies to Europe. Speaking of my personal experience, students are more and more keen to travel and to relocate to China or Japan or South Korea, and are more interested in other countries rather than the United States. This is not to say that the bond is not there, that it has been, the link has been severed or cut, but the strength of Atlanticism seems to be waning, or at least is weaker, as compared to the decade, for example, that you mentioned, discussing the origins of size, for sure.
Yeah.
It's an anecdotal answer more than
it's not.
Other one, but it's my impression of speaking of soft power.
Yeah, no, I can see what you're saying. Hartmut.
Yeah, Hartmut Meyer, adjunct here at SAIS. So thank you very much. For me, it's very difficult to ask a question because I'm so much in agreement with your fascinating and wide-ranging talk. But let me try to find questions that might be able to stipulate some discussion. When we talk about the transatlantic relationship, there's the assumption there's, at least in the talk, one America, and then there's Europe. Mm-hmm. But in reality, there are many Europes, and there are many national interpretations of the transatlantic alliance. And when we see tensions, we might not say Europe, America. We all know the Rumsfeld, Old Europe, New Europe, and different priorities that people have, the French, the German, the Italian, the British story about the transatlantic relationship. So can you enlighten us a little bit about the many Europes? The second question is the one that is always made, or very often made, is about the demographic change in America and the shift in identity. It used to be that most Americans could trace their roots to European migration. How has it changed it from that perspective? The third one is related to what you call globalization. To what extent do you think we should actually put globalization, global governance, shared responsibility for the Western script that we did write together as the anchor of transatlantic relationship, TTIP, and so on. It's about rule-making, rule-taking. It is about global governance and what role does transatlantic relationships play in the future, in your view, on sustaining global governance institutions as we know it. So thanks.
Thank you very much. Three indeed very rich, stimulating questions. The first one, hands down, you're absolutely right. For large and wide-ranging overview, you tend to simplify things. Of course, there's not one America and definitely not one Europe. But to be more specific, when referring to Europe, there have been many, cleavages, and it really depends on the time that we want to take into account. There is a divide, and there has been a divide between East and West Europe with regard to the United States, the Transatlantic Partnership, and European integration. If you think of, the Iraq War and how Eastern Europe reacted to the intervention in Iraq and the solidarity that they showed to the Bush administration. I remember heads of state and government, Eastern European countries, formerly communist country, that sent a letter to President Bush expressing solidarity. Whereas what, again, neoconservative pundits and intellectuals and politicians defined the old Europe, France and Germany first and foremost, were on a different page. But even today, you see many differences with regard to Russia, and intra-European differences have traditionally weakened European integration, but also transatlantic cohesion. France, Germany, and Italy have traditionally promoted dialogue with Moscow. The stance of countries to the east, such as Poland and the Baltic states, is distinctly more hawkish. So it depends on the issues and depends on the time that we want to take into account. I mean, France has traditionally been a very vocal, critical partner. I mentioned it in my lecture. You can find reference to 1966, 1967 everywhere today. De Gaulle decided to withdraw, France from NATO military structure. And then again, President Macron launched the idea of a European security initiative. It was during Trump's administration, and Trump's unilateral decision to pull troops out of Syria, or Trump, recurrent denunciation of the lazy Europeans. But somehow it is also applicable today, and we detect some elements of unilateralism in, Biden's administration, unilateral withdrawal from Afghanistan, just to mention one, or the Australian submarine deal, which particularly irritated the French. And you see that, France is particularly insisting on, there's nothing new under the sun, insisting on the need for Europe to act more cohesively and to diminish Europe's dependence on the United States. So, yeah, let's pick a crisis and see where European countries stood. But this is just to reinforce what you just said, that there's not one Europe, but multiple Europes that have different understanding of their strategic and defense interests and a different understanding of their relationship to the United States. Demographic changes. I'm not an expert in that. It's just mostly what I read about historians or scholars working on this. Demographic changes and generational changes definitely matter. So much so that when President Biden was elected, a remark was that he was a man of the Cold War, and he was a man of Atlanticism, the kind of generation that had an emotional attachment to Europe. Family links with European origins. It also applied, to other politicians or presidents. It is less and less so, of course. Obama was called the first Pacific president, and it's a trend that doesn't seem to be reversed. Sorry, the third question was about globalization. I think I forgot. Your question was whether or not if they can write the rules together.
Whether the Transatlantic Alliance is the anchor of global order as we know it in the future, and therefore we should emphasize the shared global responsibility for the existing institutions and patterns of the liberal order as we know it, and re-emphasize that for the future. And I refer to TTIP as an example where you can disagree on a lot of things, but maybe joint standards for the world trade regime might be a global beneficiary from good transatlantic relations. So there's a bit of a normative spin in the question.
Yeah. Yes, again, I'm sorry, I always agree, but that's what it is. So historically, as I think I tried to make clear during the lecture, the United States and Western Europe first, they worked together to institutionalize forms of cooperation. So yes, they were first and foremost committed to institutionalize forms of economic integration, trade integration, political integration, you name it. So they were a force for, they are today an historical example. They contributed to the current forms of global governance. We hope, but that's a very subjective and personal answer to the question, that they can continue to be, promoter of global order and not disorder, and order being anchored on, shared rules and practices. Then again, if you look at from the post-1970s onwards, visions of global governance promoted by the United States and Europe, European countries, the European Union itself. Again, there's not always been convergence, and the issues, the quarrels over TTIP, for instance, are just illustrative examples of this. They don't necessarily agree on how to deal with environmental issues, labor regulations, welfare issues. So it's not that there is one transatlantic/Western way of intending global governance, but I do hope that both actors, both partners, remain committed to the very idea that international affairs, however we want to interpret them, the best way to manage them is to anchor them into a system of shared practices and norms. I'm not sure I've answered your question.
No, you did very well. Alessandra, I've got two questions coming online, and one question asks very bluntly, but I'm going to expand on the bluntness of the question. Is Europe on the cusp of the start of World War III? Now, I think what that means is, but that's put very bluntly, but I think the point is Europe on the verge of a Cold War, in a Cold War, a new Cold War? And how is that going to affect transatlantic relations? I mean, is the our transatlantic relations today capable of withstanding a new Cold War? I think that's the point of the question, and I think it's a valid one. The second question that I've received is from my colleague, Raffaella Del Sato, who says, thank you for a great lecture. I was wondering whether the growing criticism at unchecked neoliberalism and the politics of austerity that's been characteristic of European scholarship and policy circles in recent years, and by no means, most of it not under the heading of souverainismo, are mirrored on the other side of the Atlantic. Do you see a growing gap between the Europe and the US in this regard? Different views of neoliberalism, different views of finance capitalism, I suppose. And if so, what do you think the implications are of this development?
Okay, thank you very much. Two great questions. I'm not sure I'm capable of answering them, but I will try. So World War III, I can't predict, so I don't know. I hope we will be able to withstand and to really confront potential military aggression against Ukraine. The current crisis is really complicated to discuss, at least for me. With hindsight, George Kennan proved to be prophetical when he argued that the enlargement of NATO would have created a condition that would have just made even more impossible to promote the democratization of Russia. On the contrary, it would have triggered Russian nationalism, authoritarianism, and eventually aggressiveness. For sure, NATO expansion, the fact that NATO got to the shores of Russia created a sense of encirclement. But the point, and thinking historically here should help, this is at least the effort that we should do, is back in the early 1990s, mid-1990s, throughout the 1990s, was it possible to avoid NATO enlargement? Was it possible not to include the countries of the former Soviet bloc? It's true that Russia felt threatened, but it's also true that Eastern, Central European countries wanted to be reassured that they would be protected in the case of another threat posed by the former imperial enemy. And there was a genuine belief that it was the only way to promote the democratization and therefore the stability of these countries. This is where we are today. NATO has weathered many crises, many more than one can imagine. So I want to be optimistic, and I want to believe that were a crisis to occur, European and Americans would be on the same side, capable of protecting not only Ukraine, but the entire region. I also want to believe that that outcome can be avoided in the first place. I hope. I hope that we will be.
No, I think that's. No, I think you're quite right. I suppose the question is there the same what you called ideological glue as during the height of the Cold War, when there was far greater risk of nuclear war? Do you think that ideological glue is still strong enough to stick us together?
When it comes to running the risk of, again, descending into a military conflict, I believe it would. But again, I don't know if it's the historian that is speaking, or it's wishful thinking of a European citizen who's very uncomfortable with the very idea of resorting to a military intervention.
Yeah, sure.
Which
actually leads on to the other question about ideological glue and Professor Del Salto's question about neoliberalism and the relative difference between the two sides of the Atlantic.
Indeed. Okay, so this is a very interesting question, and a political scientist might be better equipped to answer it, an expert in current political developments in the U.S. With two things on. The transatlantic space has seemed to be, once again, a space where transnational ideas flow and both ways. If you think of populism, it is definitely not a phenomenon confined to the United States. The Trump and Trump's version of populism, we have plenty of similar movements in Europe, and the same applies to a certain extent to the to groups that are confrontational against the establishment, are very critical of the unchecked neoliberal order, unchecked neoliberalism. And if you think of Sanders, for instance, or Ocasio-Cortez, not to say that they are anti-system, but there are definitely two figures that come to my mind that can, translate into European movements that are more openly critical of the current political system and political forces. Not sure I've answered your question, but this is what I see. I see, transatlantic convergence in terms also of political debate and political ideas and also contestation. And of course, context matters a lot, and the language Sanders speaks, the policy proposals that he put forward speak to, American history, American nation, and very peculiar set of ideas and events, but there are similar trends.
Professor David Elwood, our esteemed colleague and friend, says, the real reason why the US remains a soft power superpower is that from American society, come models of innovation that the rest of the world always have to come to terms with, whether they like it or not. I mean, this is the Redell's laboratory society argument. Huh? And, latest examples in the cultural sphere, Black Lives Matter, Me Too, wokery, but also think, he says, of the immense weight of streaming services, Silicon Valley, Seattle, just the general way in which the information revolution has derived from the United States and is influencing the rest of the world. Can the EU compete? What do you think of the role of the EU in this situation?
Thank you, David. Very interesting and controversial question, and I think I would like to answer in two ways. The first one, it's a pretty straightforward answer, is can the EU compete at the moment? One of my latest researches was on Jacques Delors and the effort to create a European social model. And I said that, in the early, mid 1980s, but throughout the 80s, there was a genuine tentative to redefine Europe, its identity, and work on the attractiveness of an alleged European model. It hasn't worked quite well. It hasn't. And in terms of appeal and capacity to project its model beyond its borders, but even within its borders. But definitely this is not the time to ask that kind of question for the EU, because no, the EU is in a rather deep state of crisis, particularly in terms of narrative and particularly in terms of soft power. At least this is my understanding. If Black Lives Matter, Me Too, Silicon Valley and all that, if this necessarily means that the United States has a soft power, yes, but it's not an unequivocal yes, in the sense that it triggers appreciation and it triggers interest, sometimes imitation, sometimes infatuation, but also contestation. And it's not, a very linear response. It speaks volumes of the fact that the United States is still a global power, very much so, but not necessarily that Europeans look at it as a model to emulate, at least not comparatively speaking. I may be wrong, but that's my hunch.
I have a question from the audience.
Hi.
Please
Thanks.
give your name and nationality.
Sure. My name is Natalie Oakes. I'm American. Thank you for a great lecture. You described capitalism as one of the pillars of the transatlantic relationship. So I was just wondering what your thoughts were, given that climate change will create an issue where the economy of scale that we've seen is no longer possible. Do you think that the transatlantic relationship is stronger in the other features that you described to withstand that? Thank you.
You're welcome. It's a very good question. My students typically ask me questions about environmental policy, and it's very good to see how committed and interested in the issue they are. And sometimes I know more than I do. In terms of, the environment has been an issue where the US and European countries and the EU have had divergent views and strategies. Differences, clashes that seem to be, put on the side with the Paris Agreement, but as we all know, came Trump, the agreement was subsided again. So will the environment work as, an element of cohesion? Perhaps, potentially, but it's not necessarily a given. Will the environment lead to a rethinking of how our capitalist systems work? Some changes are, in the making, but whether this will lead to a rethinking or remolding of the system, that is hard to tell. At least I'm not in a position to say. But global change and environmentalism has definitely created another venue for transatlantic dialogue and exchange. Although not only transatlantic, it's really a transnational global world issue that goes beyond necessarily the confines, the borders of Atlantica.
I have got one last question, although perhaps we've got time for one more question from the floor, if anybody wants to send us one. And the question is this, Alessandra. I return to this issue of ideological glue, which I rather like. You know me, I'm more of an intellectual historian than anything else. Back in the 1940s and 1950s, Arthur Schlesinger could write The Vital Center. There was a shared transatlantic agreement, and you've only got to list the names of certain authors: John Kenneth Galbraith, Tony Crosland, Isaiah Berlin, et cetera, Raymond Aron, Ignazio Silone here in Italy. I mean, all of them, of course, they had different ideas on different topics, but there was a certain intellectual justification for the transatlantic relationship at intellectual level. Do you find the same consensus, the same sense of shared values among policy, not even policy intellectuals of real significance, public intellectuals today?
Again, if the question is comparative, my answer is I don't think that we are in the same situation now. There are, of course, transatlantic think tanks. I tend to read reports and articles, and of course, given the centrality of the transatlantic relationship for them, if you only read what they produce, you have the idea that US-European relations are still the lens through which we should read international affairs. It doesn't seem to be the case to me any longer. It's not, it's not the locus, it's not the place, the dimension that interest the most intellectuals or pundits, at least in the countries where I have lived and where I've worked, and whose literary scene or magazine scenes I'm more familiar with it. Definitely not for France. Not so much for Italy. It was a different story when I was in Edinburgh, but of course, the UK being the UK, American presence there and the engagement, the dialogue with the United States has always been more sustained.
Well, Professor Meyer has a second question, in fact.
I'm very happy to relate to this, the ideological glue. And there's one general answer I would have, and then before I ask my question, is that the relative decline of the role of the public intellectual compared today and back in the past. I remember we had the debate on Ralph Dahrendorf in Oxford, and someone asked, why is there no public intellectual anymore? And Timothy Garton-Ash was very disappointed about that question because he thought there were at least some left. But on the narrative and the drivers, you said the drivers of transatlantic relations is the Soviet Union, capitalism, and the ideological glue. To what extent is actually, to some extent, a narrative of common transatlantic, but also on othering? We are not America. We are not Europe, in a sense that it's a glue for Europe to say, but we are not as crazy as the Americans are on rifles. And the Americans saying, but we don't have socialist housing policies as they have in European. And then when we talk about healthcare and so on. So to what extent do we have a parallel, the narrative of the common and the narrative of the difference, of the othering, being historically and contemporarily be part of an overall picture of the transatlantic alliance?
Very much so. Again, it's not very elegant to quote our own work, but this explains partially the answer that I'm about to give. I've worked primarily on public diplomacy, but also on identity-making processes within the Atlantic world. And the central argument is that identity is based, traditionally, historically, nothing new, on opposition. And that the United States and Europe have always been the other in their process of identity definition. It was true for the United States, the very foundation of the US. It was definitely true for the Europeans, particularly from the interwar period onwards. And it's also true for the European Union, particularly in certain moment in history. I mentioned the crisis over Iraq, 2003, but the same applies to the discussion over the European social model, or about Europe as a normative power and Europe as a civilian power. Of course, the term of comparison is the United States of America. So you confront and compare and contrast to ultimately, reflect upon yourself and come up with a better appreciation of who you are and where you stand. It works within the Atlantic Alliance, and it works for the Atlantic Alliance to define itself against others, against the Russians, against the Soviets, against the Russians, or against the Chinese, depending on, the moment and actors that we are considering. I don't know if I've answered your question.
Very well again. Alessandra, I think it's been a fascinating discussion. We can only thank you. Normally, in normal times, we have a distinctly un-transatlantic gift, which is a wine stopper made by in ceramic from local producers. So it's the essence of localism, not globalism. I hope you'll be coming over here in person to talk again, and we'll be able to give you your wine stopper for doing it. Thanks very much for talking to us. I just wanted to ask you one final thing about your book.
Yeah.
When is it coming out? I mean, when will it come out? And will you do an English edition?
So when will it come out? I hope the publisher is not online. In theory, I would have to hand in the manuscript by the end of April. It's not going to be ready before May or June. This means that it should definitely appear in the fall or end of the year. Will there be an English translation? I don't know. I guess it very much depends on how it will be received. But it is published in Italian, and then we'll see.
Well, I'm hoping
Fingers crossed.
I'm hoping we'll be able to have you over here again to talk about.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Alessandra. That was terrific.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.